Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to use the November 2024 3D embossing folder of the month, and I'm going to create some Oriental umbrella cards. When I first saw this umbrella or this embossing folder, the first thing I thought of was those Oriental umbrellas, those absolutely gorgeous paper umbrellas. And I have this vision of them over a walkway. I don't know if this is a real thing or if I've just seen a picture somewhere. So I wanted to kind of create that look. So I have some distress watercolor cardstock here. I have a piece that's 5.5 inches by 8.5 inches. I'm going to use some temporary adhesive to kind of temporarily tape it to my embossing folder. To be honest, the temporary adhesive doesn't work super well because there's so much texture to this embossing folder. And in full disclosure, I do this the wrong way for the first little bit, and it's not until I'm kind of a little bit into it that I realize it. But I wanted to keep this into the video so that you see what it looks like the opposite way. So when I'm inking an embossing or embossed image, I like to use temporary tape to tape my paper in, and then I use my ink pad on the other side of the embossing folder to ink it. Here I'm using some black StazOn ink because I'm going to do some watercoloring, and I want to make sure that the black ink that I'm using is not going to run or bleed. So I will do this several times until I get a good ink coverage to my background, and the same is no different with the StazOn ink. I will do this, I think, 3 times, and then I will start my watercoloring. I don't need to wait too long for the watercoloring because it dries really quickly. And again, you do want to make sure that you use a permanent ink for this, and you also want to make sure that your ink is totally dry when you start the watercoloring process. So once I'm completely done with this, I'm going to do my watercoloring with a bunch of different distress refill inks. This will work with any watercolor. I like to use the distress refills because I already have them for re-inking my ink pads. They are nice and transparent because they are a dye-based ink. But if you only have, say, distress ink pads, you can do this by just smushing your ink pad onto a non-porous surface and using that as a palette. For all of my umbrellas, I'm using one color on the outside and one color on the inside, and I'm trying to make sure that that area is still moist so those two colors kind of blend together. I thought these would look beautiful with the two colors blended together, but you could easily do your umbrellas a solid color. Now I'm going to take this one background and create 2 cards out of it. So I am going to do a couple umbrellas the same color scheme. This is going to be cut in half, so these aren't going to be showing up on the same background. For the first colors there, I used some squeezed lemonade and some picked raspberry. I remember some of the colors that I used, but I don't remember all of them. This one here is Mowed Lawn. Basically what I did was I concentrated on some of the bright colors that I had. This one here I believe was Tumbled Glass. And again, the colors don't necessarily matter. What is important to me is that the areas are staying wet. So when I do the outside part and then I do the inside part, those 2 ink colors blend together. So I'm also, when I'm choosing my ink colors, I'm trying to choose colors that would blend together well. So I'm not choosing colors that are on the opposite side of the color wheel because I don't really want them to blend together and to kind of create brown. I'm trying to create some beautiful, vibrant umbrellas here. Now, the only thing that I regret from this project is I wish I had some tiny stamps to create the beautiful patterns that those umbrellas normally have to them. Because of the texture from this embossing, it doesn't really work that way. So after getting a little bit into my background, I realized that I think I had inked the wrong side of the embossing folder. And to be honest, it's usually pretty easy to me to figure out which side of the embossing folder needs to be inked. And this one I had a little bit more difficulty with. And I am much happier with the second embossing, but I wanted to keep that first one in. So if your embossing looks like mine, you've likely done the wrong side just like I did. So I did the same steps as the first one. I put it into I put the distress watercolor onto the embossing folder, and then I inked it completely with some black StazOn ink. And I repeated that process a couple times. Now, partly through the second time, I realized that my ink pad was fairly dry. I wasn't getting as much ink as I wanted to on my embossing folder. So I did also stop and re-ink or refill my ink pad, and I do show that on here. But you want to repeat this process until you get enough ink coverage for that background, and you want it to be fairly solid. Because I'm using black ink here, any of the areas that I'm using that distress ink on that black ink are not going to show up because it's black and that distress ink is completely clear. Here's where I'm inking my ink pad. I have exactly the same ink refill, and I'm just going around, and I kind of go both ways. I do some horizontal, I do some vertical, and you can see when your ink pad is really inking up the ink or soaking up the ink super quick, how dry it is. So once I had done that, I let it sit for a few minutes. Typically I'll let it sit for a half an hour to an hour, but for the technique that I was doing, I wasn't going to stamp anything. I was just inking an embossing folder, so I didn't need to wait quite as long. And I really noticed with that last inking that I was getting much more ink on that embossing folder. Now, because I'm using permanent ink on that embossing folder, I need to use a permanent ink cleaner to clean it up. So I'm using some Ultra Clean right here. It works really, really well for cleaning up that ink. And I'm using just a dry cloth to remove any of that cleaner and any of that ink. Now, the one thing with Ultra Clean is it does kind of leave an oily residue. So once I was done with this, I took it under my tap with some warm water and just some hand soap. I put some hand soap right on that embossing folder, used my fingers to kind of put it into all the nooks and crannies, and then completely rinsed it off, and I had all of that oily residue removed. And I wanted to keep that in there because I wanted you to see exactly how to clean that ink off of there. Anytime you're using a permanent ink on your embossing folders, you do want to clean that off. And I do that fairly quickly just to make sure that the ink doesn't set. But you can see right away that this background has a much different look than that first background, and I'm much happier with it. That first background, the way it was, I didn't have a clear outline for each one of those umbrellas, and I realized as I was working on it that I just wanted a clear outline basically. And I love this second background so much more. Even just black and white, I think it looks really, really cool. The other thing I think could be cool with this is it almost looks like rosettes from like prize ribbons. I think you could get really fun with it. And I can think it could even be like stylized flowers. So I'm going to do the same technique with this as I did with the first one. I'm using my distress refills. Any dye-based refill will work with this. You can use other things other than dye-based watercolors as well. The only thing to keep in mind though, say if you use metallic watercolors, is that's going to show up on top of the black ink. I specifically chose the distress ones because I knew they were not going to show up on top of the black. I was going to see that black outline or those black details on there, and I really love the look of that. Obviously, that's not true to the Chinese or Japanese umbrellas. They don't have those black details on there, but I did think they gave this a little bit of a different look, and it just gives each one of those umbrellas an outline to it. So I have a water brush here that I'm using that has water in the handle. You can see a little piece of paper towel to my right. Regularly when I'm going in between colors, I will clean off my brush onto that piece of paper towel. And all that requires is me squeezing my brush a little bit. It flushes some water through that brush and it cleans that color out. When I go into my next color, I want to make sure that I have a clean brush so I'm not contaminating my colors. Now, this particular project had a couple purposes for me. Not only did I have this idea in my head and I wanted to try it out and see if it had the look that I wanted, and I absolutely love the look of it. The other thing is I haven't redone my ink palettes with my Distress reinkers since all of the last 12 new Distress refill colors came out. So I wanted to redo them. So I'm trying to use up as much of that ink that I have in my palettes as possible before rinsing them out and redoing my palette so that I have all of those new colors in there. So I am trying to go into the colors that I have the most ink of, as well as trying to keep it with the bright colors. I wanted to keep this very bright and very vibrant looking. I'm going to use these for backgrounds for my cards, but I think they would even be fun just to use as partial backgrounds. You could have a straight edge on one and then do some fussy cutting around some different umbrellas, and I think that would create a really cool and unique look as well. And then you could go with a bright background or solid color piece of cardstock to go with it. As I'm going through this, I'm trying to make sure that I don't have two umbrellas with the same color combinations right beside each other. So sometimes I will have yellow on the inside and I will do an umbrella beside it that has yellow on the outside. And that's totally fine with me. I just don't want to have two of the same, exactly the same ones right beside each other. And with this many colors of distress reinkers, it's really easy to get some great combinations here. I think I'd have even more combinations if I were to pull out my reinkers and refill some of those wells. But like I said, I was trying to use it up and clean out those palettes to redo them. So I just go through and I completely do this entire background. I started out by doing same ones or similar ones on the left side and the right side. And then as we get to the outer edges of my cardstock, I'm just concentrating on making sure that they're different from the umbrellas that are beside them. And this process went fairly quickly. The only thing I need to do once it's completely dry is wait for everything to dry before I work on or before I continue to create the cards that I'm creating. Now again, I'm using 2 colors per umbrella just because I really like that look, but you could also just do 1 color per umbrella, and I think that would be beautiful. What I would do then is I would do that 1 color, and then I would go in with that same color and just do a darker area either on the outer area or have it darker in the center and then have it lighter on the outside just to give it a little bit of visual dimension. I think that would be gorgeous. Another thing that I think might be kind of interesting is doing this on vellum so you have that transparency or translucency to it. The only thing is though, is I would be putting that onto some white cardstock, so you might lose some of that, but I think that would be an interesting way to use this embossing folder as well. I absolutely love the unique look this gives. And even just embossed on its own with 1 color, I think it looks beautiful. I've already used this on a previous video. I used this right at the beginning of the month for my November clubs video. So if you want to see it just used with some solid color cardstock, I use it in 2 different cards over there. Now I went and I just sped up my video because everything is very repetitive here and there's no real new techniques. I do the exact same thing for all of the umbrellas. And like I said, there's a lot of umbrellas here. I find watercolor very zen, very, like I kind of get lost in it. So I love doing it. I know it's not everyone's cup of tea. You could also use some dye-based markers with this to do that watercoloring. Tombow markers, Karen markers, those would work perfect for this as well and have some gorgeous, vibrant color to it. So once that is completely dried, I took a Tombow marker, just a black one, and any of those areas that are kind of background areas for this background that the black didn't completely cover, I just touched them up with that Tombow marker. Now, I don't plan on using any moisture after this, so the Tombow marker, even though it's a dye-based marker, worked just fine for that. If you were going to use any moisture or say mist it with some shimmer spray or whatnot, I would wait until that shimmer spray was dry to do this or use a permanent marker. So I'm trimming this down now, and I'm trimming it down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. My husband was talking to me while I was doing this, so you'll see that I'm measuring things while I'm doing this just to make sure I'm doing it right. Because again, he kept talking to me, and I don't even remember what he was talking to me about, but it was hard to focus on what I was doing while he started talking. For the background or for the matte for this, I'm using some Hero Arts Azalea cardstock. I loved the vibrant pink of this, so I wanted to use that as a matte. I kept my image piece or my umbrella piece fairly big for this card, so my mat is fairly small. So the mat is 5 3/8 inches by 4 1/8 inches. So you just see a tiny little bit of that outline. I think it would be gorgeous outlined in black as well, but I wanted to keep them fairly similar. I'm just using some different sentiments with each one of them, and I'm just going to change one of those backgrounds up just slightly, just a little addition to it. For my sentiments, I'm using the clear stamp of the month. This one has several different sentiments. Most of them are kind of geared towards birthday. I'm using one is something about sprinkled in magic. I'm just using 2 of them that I thought worked with the background. I'm going to use them on just some white Hammermill cardstock here, and I am using some VersaMark ink, and I'm going to emboss them. So I took my embossing powder tool over that piece of cardstock. I want to make sure that I have as crisp of sentiments as possible. So then I stamped it with VersaMark ink, and I repeated that process a couple times just to make sure that it was nice and clearly stamped. Then I'm going to go in with some black embossing powder so that that black embossing powder is going to tie in with the black outlines on my umbrellas. Now I kept the background for these sentiments white. You could easily do this on watercolor cardstock and use one of the re-inkers that you used for the umbrellas and color it. I chose not to do that because that background is so colorful. I thought if I did that, it would kind of just blend into that background, and I wanted to make sure that that sentiment was going to pop up or pop off of that background, and by having that white outline, I thought it did that. Another reason I used this embossing or this clear stamp set was because it has coordinating dies with it, so I could get some really nice die cut sentiments for the front of my card so that I wasn't covering most of my card, or wasn't covering a large amount of my card. I was covering as little as possible, but still having that sentiment. Another option would be to put that sentiment on the inside of the card. That would work as well. But because that background is kind of like a all over pattern, I thought a sentiment might break it up just a tiny little bit. Now I chose these sentiments, these stamp sentiments. I think it would also look fantastic with a die cut sentiment on the front as well. A layered die cut sentiment would look perfect as well. So gluing on that mat, and then I'm going to glue on my emboss piece. I'm using some Barely Art glue here. It's a nice liquid glue, and I'm making sure that I have lots of glue on the recessed areas, the areas that are going to have contact with that mat. I want to make sure that my emboss piece, because there's so much texture to it, is going to stay. Once I've let that sit for a little bit, I am putting on my sentiment, and once again putting that acrylic block on there just to make sure that everything has some really good contact. To add a little bit of texture and sparkle, I decided to outline all of my umbrellas with some Stickles glitter glue. This is just a fine glitter that has glue right in it, and it has a really fine tip to it, so you can get as detailed as you want, and I love the sparkle that it gives those umbrellas. For the little center to the top of the umbrella, I'm just going to add a dot of glossy accents to each one of them. I was considering making that entire top glossy, but I also didn't want to take attention away from those umbrellas, so I just decided on a dot instead. Once I have those done, I'm going to set them aside to dry while I'm working on my second card and the little addition that I want to make to it. And I really love the detail that just the glossy accents and the stickles add to it. It doesn't take anything away from the color of this card, because the two things that I'm using, the glossy accents and the stickles, they're not colored. They're just going to add a little bit of texture, a little bit of shine, and a little bit of sparkle. For my second card, I thought I would pull in my Cloud9 interference pads. For this particular one, I chose colors that were based on what they were going to look like on light cardstock. So this first one I'm using here is Pink Champagne. I chose it for the blue color, and I'm putting it on the center parts of the umbrellas, the blue areas. I'm only focusing for these colors on the center parts of the umbrellas. I don't necessarily want everything interference colored. I just want to add that little tiny bit of interference shine that this has. The second color I'm using there was Sweet Treat, and I concentrated that on the yellow areas. Then we have Summer Garden, and put that on the green areas. Each one of these colors, or each one of these ink pads, has a different color to it and a different interference color to it. I have a ink blending brush for each one of these pads. You don't want to mix them up, and you also don't want to use the ink blending brushes you use for these pads with your other inks. You don't want to contaminate anything there. This last one here is Pumpkin Spice, and I think in the middle of there I had Opal Blush. I might have mixed up the Opal Blush and Pink Champagne. Anyways, I chose the colors based on the color on the left side of the pad, what they were going to look like on the light side, or the light color of cardstock. So this just adds a beautiful shimmer to it. It's very, very subtle. So again, it doesn't take away from any of the color from that umbrella. It just adds a really nice subtle shimmer. I'm going to put that same mat that I used for the last card. I really love this Azalea cardstock. It's just a nice, vibrant, bright pink. And then I'm going to glue down my embossed piece here. Again, making sure to put a lot of that glue on the areas that are recessed that are going to have contact with that mat behind it. Then while I'm waiting for that to dry, I can glue my sentiment on there. And there we have our background. That interference has had a few minutes to dry, so you see it just a tiny little bit more. For the centers of the tops of the umbrellas here, I'm just using some black diamond stickles. This is just going to add that focal point, that dot to the top of the umbrella. It's not going to add a ton of sparkle, because once this is dry, it's kind of matte and it's just more of a black texture to it. So here we have our two backgrounds here. This one's the first one that has the stickles as well as the glossy accents. And you can see that it just adds a little bit of definition to those umbrellas and a little bit of sparkle, but it doesn't take away from any of those colors. Then we have our second one where we use the interference pad. And again, it just adds a little shimmer, a little shine, but it doesn't take away from any of the vibrant colors from those umbrellas. And this is just to give you a different idea or a different way to use that embossing folder. I love the texture. I think it would be great for just everyday cards, but I also love using it for unique things like this. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.